Thank you, everyone, for joining us here. Our first of top 8 matches. It's the 2 versus 7. It's between Ben Lau and Dan Lanthier. On Living End, Ben near the top of the standings all day today. He's facing off, though, against one of his harder ones. It's the control deck from Dan Lanthier.
Yeah, Living End, a deck that pops into Modern now and again. Never really had a dominant stretch in the format, at least that I can recall. Whereas really just Do Nothing Azorius Control is a deck that only very recently got very significant increases in its power level. Search for Azcanta, Teferi Hero of Dominaria, the unbanning of Jace the Mind Sculptor, all this stuff, a lot of points in favor of playing a deck like Azorius Control.
Yeah, Azorius Control originally was a kind of a fringe version of Jeskai. You'd see that, Jeskai was your go-to Colonnade deck. It really has picked up recently. You're mentioning cards like Search for Azcanta and Teferi powering it up. Right now, it seems just picked up because of these graveyard decks we've been seeing as of late. The fact that Azorius, almost all their removal exiles, seems very significant.
Yeah, definitely. Living End generally is going to prey on decks that rely heavily on creatures. The fact that the Living End is also a sweeper effect before you get to a crack back with whatever creatures you cycled. And the less good your Living Ends specifically are against your opponent's game plan, Azorius Control, mostly just a Planeswalker deck, and the fact that it has so many exiling effects, a sweeper and Terminus just puts creatures on the bottom. Pretty bad stuff for the Living End side of things.
So we're on the second turn here. For Ben Lau, he cycled Horror of the Broken Lands on his first turn. On the second turn, he's led by cycling Street Wraith. He still has some wants where mana is concerned. Blood Crypt and Kessig Wolfrun are it. And he's actually just going to go ahead and evoke a Shriekmaw to the graveyard to help him build up that critical mass.
Kind of amusing. The 2 creatures he cycled, they are black, so bringing back the Shriekmaw, it's not forced to target anything.
Now the question is whether Ben will hit that third land. He doesn't have it. He has, looks like 2 Simian Spirit Guides, however.
So he can't Violent Outburst with this. He would have to have a creature to target with Demonic Dread.
3 mana. He's going to go ahead and pitch a Simian Spirit Guide, exile that to make Fulminator Mage. We'll look over on Dan's side and see if that's going to work. It does. He does not have one of his one-of Mana Leak at the ready.
Yeah, no cards in graveyard, even if he did have Logic Knot.
It looks like Dan does have his main deck, one of his 2 main deck negates in hand, though. So when Ben goes for Living End, Dan will have an answer.
Yeah, for now, just needs to keep up on lands.
Yeah, single white source here that Ben could tag with Fulminator Mage. Blooming Marsh looks to be the pickup, so Ben should be online now.
Right. Probably see an attack with the Fulminator Mage. I like going for the Hallowed Fountain before Lanthier gets up to 4 mana. You don't want to allow him to start casting Cryptic commands.
On this last turn, rather than immediately Stone Raining with the Fulminator Mage, Ben is actually held back for a turn. Is it the damage, or is he waiting to see if there's a better target?
The target doesn't really matter, as long as you manage the mana. You can hit a Celestial Colonnade, but the game's not really about that sort of thing. Yeah, this is kind of what he has going for him. There's no certainty with regard to actually resolving a Living End.
Okay.
And it's a free effect. Even if he wants to use it this turn, he doesn't need to necessarily fire away that just yet.
4th land for Dan. It's 3 basic islands and a Hallowed Fountain. So he's going to tap to make Search for Azcanta, leaving up, very importantly, 2 basic lands here.
Right. 2 islands that can cast that negate in hand.
So by not using Fulminator Mage, this has allowed Dan to leave up negate. I see Ben will go for Beast Within on end step on one of the lands, though. I do like this quite a bit.
Yeah, that forces action because either you can Mana Leak this, or this resolves, and then you won't have Mana Leak mana when Lau goes for some kind of Cascade spell on his own turn.
So he's forced into it, so Lanthier just goes for negate on the Beast Within, which means... Oh, I can see this. Demonic Dread and Violent Outburst are both live. That might be a reason to keep around a Fulminator Mage, too.
Right. Yeah, having a target. Lanthier's not going to give you very many creatures to target with the target creature can't block part of Demonic Dread, and if you can't cast that, you can't Cascade. Looks like another Violent Outburst was picked up. Yeah, it was a nice setup there with the Beast Within, with Lanthier casting the Search for Azcanta. Lau will have a window to set up. And also, Lanthier currently just islands. So they need to find a white source of mana to be able to produce that if he even could Miracle a Terminus.
And I like this a lot. So Fulminator Mage will knock Dan just down to some islands. Here is Living End from Lau. He's going to get a whole host of creatures back. Looks like we have Shriekmaw, Fulminator Mage, Horror of the Broken Lands, and Street Wraith. So it's a total of 12 power.
Yep. And the Horror of the Broken Lands also gets +2/+1 when you cycle or discard a card. So if he could chain some cyclers, this could be lethal on the following turn.
Yeah, he would need 2 cards to cycle, and that's pretty in range for the deck. Lanthier uses Search for Azcanta to bin a negate. He picked up Mana Leak, and actually no land, he just passes. This is not where he wants to be at all.
Right. No 4th mana means no access to Cryptic Command, even if he has one, and no white source means at least on the next turn he still can't Miracle a Terminus, even if one shows up. I believe that Lau's hand... Okay, he does have a Violent Outburst, so he can use that to shove for lethal on this turn. Lanthier does have a counterspell for that, but, you know, it's worth casting. He would have an uncounterable way to do this if he had multiple cyclers through the Horror of the Broken Lands.
Okay.
Either way here, though, Lanthier needs to top deck something to get through the following turn.
So Ben will go for the Violent Outburst. That pump for 4 is lethal. This should force a counterspell from Lanthier. He'll Cascade into a Living End, which he'll decline to cast.
Yep, you decline to cast it, and then it gets shuffled in with the rest of the stuff you cascaded.
See a nice look at the main deck here of Ben Lau.
Right. So, Lanthier has seen the deck list. That's all face up. This is an elimination round.
And Mana Leak on the Violent Outburst. Violent Outburst gives attacking creatures +1/+0. So Dan will just take 12 instead of 16.
A really powerful constructed level card there. That's why, you know, Lanthier had to counter it.
Dan down to 4. Now Ben's hand, pretty soft if Dan could produce some sort of Terminus or something like that. But drawing Jace isn't going to do it. So game 1.
He had to flip past the Celestial Colonnade because it enters the battlefield tapped and then just finds a 4-mana spell. Nothing he can do. And Benjamin Lau already up a game.
Big win there on the Living End side.
Things are going to get tougher as we look at sideboards, but getting through the first game is a big deal.
Well, what I liked what happened with Ben there is that between Beast Within and that Violent Outburst, he was just able to overload Dan's mana. It was a bit of a punishment, I think, for Dan casting that Search for Azcanta.
Yes. Yeah, he did not have more lands, so it didn't look like he was building towards a better turn to do that. But the coast ended up just not being clear. Yeah, that Beast Within followed by the Living End. Yeah, it had to be specifically... It could have even been Demonic Dread. So all 8 of the Cascaders were live. So you're trying to fade the Beast Within with that line, and just he failed to do that, and that was really the whole game.
Yeah, I mean, it's challenging Ben to make double two relevant threats, right? Whether they're Beast Within's, Demonic Dreads, or Violent Outbursts. Well, 2 Demonic Dreads wouldn't work, but anything else would there. And Ben had it.
Right. And it specifically being Beast Within ended up being an issue when it came in terms of if Lanthier just had 4 lands going forward, then he can start Cryptic Commanding at least, tread water that way.
Or even if he's really worried about the untap, he could just let the land get Beast Within and still hold up his negate.
Right.
Either way, we go to the second game. Now, Dan does get extra tools out of the sideboard. We were looking at this earlier, and some of them are pretty good. Mainly, I'm looking at some of this graveyard hate. Dan has, in terms of graveyard hate, he has 2 Stony Silence and 1 Surgical Extraction.
2 Rest in Peace,
That's what I mean. Rest in Peace. It's the other 2 mana enchantment.
Right.
Those I expect to see. Certainly the Rest in Peace. Probably the Surgicals. Or maybe not.
Yeah, the Surgical it's fine. Once you win a fight over a Living End, if you get to counterspell one, then you Surgical Extraction that card. Okay. And you should be in pretty good shape from there. Then you can actually just use 1-for-1 removal when Benjamin Lau is just hard casting the draft commons in the deck.
Yeah, how do you feel about any of the other cards in this sideboard?
So previously we saw Lanthier playing against Dredge, and in that matchup, the Baneslayer Angel, the Lyra Dawnbringer, they were pretty good. In this matchup, they're really just not going to work.
Right, I don't think I'd like those. Disdainful Stroke only really counters things if he's planning to go to the place where Ben starts casting these creatures.
Right, and that's really not the fight that we're fighting.
No. Supreme Verdict, it's interesting, it's a sweeper, but it doesn't exile. So does that follow something he wants or doesn't want?
I don't mind Verdict. You know, it resets as long as you're able to maintain some lands. If you can get his plains on the battlefield, some islands, you know, just his basic lands, and he's not getting hit by Fulminator Mage, then you can actually fight that fight going along. I like a small number of Dispel, and you get to confirm the efficacy with these face-up sideboards. They don't always play it anymore, but Lao has 2 sideboard Ricochet traps.
Okay.
And if you want to counterspell a Living End, and Lao just has an extra red or even Simian Spirit Guide floating around, you can Ricochet trap your counterspell to not counter the Living End.
Yeah, so that Dispel would counter Ricochet traps. It would counter Beast Withins.
Yep, yeah, that one can be a big deal too.
Yeah. I think it's just those targets. I mean, it could target Violent Outburst. That's not really the point. But those are 5 very good targets.
Yeah, we saw him counter a Violent Outburst in Game 1, but you're right. That is not that's not the mode number 1. That's not what we're trying to do.
And players going to draw 7s for game number 2. Ben Lau, mentioned, was unhappy to draw this matchup. He's got to be pretty excited to win the first game.
Right. 2 hard ones ahead of him, though.
And Lanthier going to go to 6.
And Lau's keeping on 7, though. His deck presents a lot of keepable hands.
Right.
A lot of lands and cards with cycling, so largely you can keep lands and spells. He has a small number of sideboard cards he cares about. As you mentioned, there's those 2 Ricochet traps, though not a ton else that he's reaching for in this matchup. And just given that there's so few sideboard cards that matter, probably just looking for cyclers and lands.
Yeah, I think the range of keepable hands is really high. One thing, though, is that with Living End, their best hands and their medium hands oftentimes play very similarly. You know, give them 2 extra cards, and they might just make the same plays anyway.
Right, and also sometimes their best and their medium hands are determined by what the cyclers even draw. It's not a matter of what the first 7 cards are. It's a matter of what they draw into.
Well, some interesting stuff. I have some game 1s completed across the bracket. And, Ryan, I would say all 4 of them went opposite to matchup that we had thought here.
Oh, wow.
Dylan Hand with Humans up a game over Brendan Klein's Affinity deck. We have Sean Dhaliwal's Humans deck up a game over Mark's Burn deck. Paul Muller wins game 1 with Storm over Stefan Mazeroski's Burn deck.
Yeah, there is a kind of the lesson here about Modern. You can't go too terribly wrong if you're being proactive.
Yeah.
And this upset here is kind of the most pronounced version of that.
The
Living End deck versus the Do-Nothing deck.
Yeah. So, Lanthier starting off on a Colonnade. Lau going to get some a Street Wraith into the graveyard and then passes. And just some mana early on for Lanthier. Looking at his hand, looks like he has a Cryptic Command and a Logic Knot. For the second game in a row, though, he hasn't had any fetch lands on the first 2 turns for that counterspell.
Right. It's unlikely that we see Lau set up from here for like a turn 2 Living End. That would involve Simian Spirit Guide. So on this turn, the second land that enters tapped, there's no graveyard, but with the third land entering untapped, he'll at least be able to Logic Knot for 1.
Sure. Yeah, Lau would need a Spirit Guides to power through that.
Right. He would need a Spirit Guide, and he'd probably also want some more graveyard. At least a Street Wraith. Ooh.
3 mana for a turn Spirit Guide to get a turn 2 Fulminator Mage. Lau's going to shoot down that Colonnade.
That's pretty powerful. And the only land I saw, okay, there is an island to go with this, so that's reasonable. I thought he had Field of Ruin, but with basic island, he still represents Logic Knot for 1.
But aggressive line by Lau, I don't mind it. It's going to cycle Horror of the Broken Lands. Finds Beast Within. He can go... Living End against these control decks can be very aggressive toward the other player's mana base.
Right. It would have been great to have a second Fulminator Mage here. With Beast Within being the card, I believe he does have another Simian Spirit Guide. You will likely see him cast that on Lanthier's turn, the value it being an instant.
Yeah, end-stepped Beast Withining a land.
Yeah, you would target the island, and then if he has a Violent Outburst or draws into one...
Ryan, Dan said go. He missed land 3.
Oh, wow.
And now Lau's going to go after that island. Logic Knot will counter, so it's a 2-for-1 for Lanthier, but he missed a land drop.
We'll see if we have a Violent Outburst, and he does, and that's going to get Fulminator Mage back, too.
Yeah, I mean, if he has that, or if he has another Fulminator in his hand, it's Violent Outburst. That is the play. You're absolutely right.
This game might be over.
Lau, you can tell he's picked up his pace. He knows that things are going his way.
He's going to get 7 power between the Street Wraith and the Horror of the Broken Lands, just at their base, plus Fulminator Mage, which is probably just going for that Colonnade right away.
Dan missed a land drop. I'm all about taking care of that Colonnade.
Oh, and he has another Cycler, too. You see he's holding priority with the Living End on the stack, fetching up this swamp.
Oh, sure. Yeah, Cycle Horror. Lau might make this one a quick 2-0. A surprise, to be sure. You see, he actually cycled into Living End as well. It's one of the reasons you do all this with it on the stack. But 2 Horrors back, Fulminator Mage, Street Wraith blows up the Colonnade. Lanthier's down to a single island.
Right, and he can't go for that Colonnade fast enough. That would be potentially Terminus mana, and he has to shut that off.
Dan draws Opt. It's all he can cast right now.
So he has to find White Source here, and he has to find Terminus next.
Well,
that's Terminus.
Too soon.
That's
he draws
not going to do it.
And you see it. Here's a swing for 11. Dan's down to 9. Now that he doesn't have a White Source, I don't think he has a way out.
And Benjamin Lau getting through this one's going to be a big deal for the rest of the top 8.
Dan Lanthier picks up the card. So Ben Lau, the domination today continues 2-0. A quick win for the Living End player, and he is on to the semifinals.
Yeah, some struggle there. You saw it in Game 2. Lanthier mulligans to 6. Ends up with a land light hand that was pretty vulnerable to Fulminator Mage. Lau got to aggressively just go on this land destruction plan, and even though the Living End aspect of the deck does have some vulnerabilities here, just those Fulminator Mages, those Beast Withins, they added a lot of percentage points here, and Lau was able to leverage those very effectively.